Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Patricia Murphy, here with the newest member of the AJC politics team, Riley Bunch. Riley, it's great to have you.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here, Patricia.
We have already thrown you in at the deep end, Riley Bunch. So you've been with City Hall for a long time, but now we've got you full-time doing campaigns, elections, and any other catastrophe that we might need to send you out to. So thanks for doing it, and thanks for being here on the podcast while Greg is out.
Yeah, I'm so excited to chat. We have such a busy couple of days, haven't we?
We really have, and we're going to get into it right now. Right now, we're 2 weeks from Georgia's runoff elections, and Sunday showed that Democrats and Republicans are in two very different places, united and divided, at least for now. Earlier in the day, Republicans Mike Collins and Derek Dooley battled against each other in their latest debate ahead of their increasingly bitter runoff for the GOP nomination to face off against Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff. And in the governor's race, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and billionaire Rick Jackson won't even debate each other because Jackson skipped his GOP debate for an event with Senator Rick Scott from Florida. That left Jones debating an empty podium, as you well know, Riley, because you were moderating that one-man debate, and we'll hear more about that from you later in the week. The still scrambled Republican picture was a stark contrast to the Democrats over the weekend. That's when Ossoff was joined by Democrats' new nominee for governor, former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Bottoms, for their first rally together as a unified ticket. Riley, first, let's talk about the GOP debate between Representative Collins and Derek Dooley. Collins and Dooley were both very pro-Trump. They both voiced support for the president's actions in Iran, his ballroom, and his weaponization fund. I felt like they seemed like the hardliner versus the happy warrior to me. It felt a little bit like Collins was back on his heels a bit defensive, and Dooley, who has not debated much at all, was really pushing him on a number of issues.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that we saw much that we haven't seen from the candidates before, right? You know, like you said, they doubled down on support of President Donald Trump and a lot of the initiatives that he's pushing in Washington. We have this political kind of insider versus outsider narrative that we always see when we have a candidate that doesn't have, a political record that they're running on going up against someone who does have a political record that they're running on. So I'm not sure that this gave undecided voters or voters who backed other candidates a good, pathway of who they might want to back. Not sure if they carved out distinct lanes on either of their side, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, Patricia.
Yeah, I was struck. I was not surprised, but I was interested in how much Collins had to continue to defend himself on the ethics charges that came up 3 times, including in these exchanges between Collins and Dooley. This is Collins talking about the ethics committee investigation into him, which he repeatedly said was not an investigation. Here's that sound.
We'll work with the ethics committee. If they have any questions, we'll be glad to answer those questions. But that has not been taken up. It's bogus. It's a nothing burger. And we look forward to going on and pushing that past us. This ethics committee has not taken this up as an investigation. It is a nothing burger. It was filed by an anonymous complaint. And if they have any questions, they have anything they want to discuss with us, I'm more than happy to talk about it.
Okay, we're going to have
Mike,
to.
That's not true. They have
to leave
taken it up.
there.
There's only 4 cases they're reviewing of the thousands.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We want to move on, all right?
All right.
Dooley has said that Collins can't win with these staff scandals in his background. Do you feel like Collins put that to rest with those answers?
I do not think so. This is something that is going to continuously come up. And we even saw it a target of Democrats. Senator Jon Ossoff brought this up in his rally with Keisha Bottoms. I know we're going to get into that a little bit later. But this is something that also is kind of doesn't have an end to it. We don't have a result of this ethics investigation. We had, that kind of startling tweet from one of his top advisors just recently. So this isn't something that's going to go away. I don't think that Representative Collins can just, I addressed it during the debate and we can move on for it. It's definitely something that's going to come up all the way into the runoff.
Yeah,
and
I feel
after.
I think I definitely agree with that. As you said, we know what Ossoff would do with that if Collins ends up being the nominee. Also, a number of the staff, at least one member of his staff is still with him, his current chief of staff, who used to be Matt Gaetz' former chief of staff as well. So I think, especially until the ethics committee comes back either with a definitive answer or they decide to drop it altogether, and this process takes so incredibly long on the Hill, I don't feel like it's going to be resolved. It certainly won't be resolved before the runoff, and it doesn't feel like it'll be resolved until November either. Now, something that Collins was very intent on going after Dooley on was about his immigration record on both immigration and abortion. Derek Dooley has given some answers and interviews that leaves a little bit of a gray area as to exactly how he feels about both of those issues. Here is how immigration came up between Collins and Dooley when Collins was really trying to push Dooley on that.
This immigration system is, I would say, the most reckless act of any president in my lifetime. What the Biden administration and Ossoff did, letting these illegal immigrants come in unchecked, wreaking havoc on our country. I do not support in any way a pathway to citizenship for illegal immigrants.
And Collins and Dooley battled over immigration one more time later in the debate.
Angel families and people that are harmed by these illegal immigrants out here, they deserve somebody that's going to stand up for them, not someone who has the same immigration policies as John Ossoff.
Okay.
Do I say anything after that? I mean, a typical politician. I mean, he's not listening to one thing I've said and he's putting words in my mouth.
So, Riley, I feel like we know that immigration has always been a huge, huge issue for Republicans. And I do feel like it makes sense for Collins to try to put space between him and Dooley on that issue right ahead of this runoff.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned before, Dooley doesn't have this political record where he's like, here is a vote that I took, or here is where I stood on immigration. And he hasn't really come outright and said it. I think that dancing around the responses from that, his campaign might see as a benefit for him, because it does leave a little wiggle room for voters on that issue, right? But also Mike Collins can point out that we don't have a particular stance on him on these very, very important kind of culture war issues, especially with immigration right now and the federal government's actions related to ICE and local cities. It's a top issue for Republican voters for sure. So it'll be interesting to see how he addresses that closer to the runoff, if he does at all.
Yeah, I think Dooley's response on immigration and on a number of other issues, including on Collins' response to his ethics concerns, was just to say, there's a typical politician. You cannot trust a thing that Mike Collins is saying. Collins has only been up there for a term and a half, but I do feel like this is a very kind of outsider anti-incumbency year right now. I feel like that's an effective way for Dooley to dismiss a number of these things that are getting pushed back at him on the policy side. He said, look, I support President Trump. I'm in the same place as President Trump on abortion. I'm in the same place as him on immigration. But his tone is very different on immigration. I think there is some space and the substance on immigration as well. But to turn it around and just try and paint Collins and everything he says as just a typical political response that you can't trust, I feel like that's the right place for Dooley to be going.
Which is also funny because, they're giving the same responses, right? Whatever President Donald Trump is doing, that is what we're going to back. So it's interesting to kind of see this dynamic of calling each other out for different stances on different issues, and yet they're echoing pretty much the same policies, Patricia.
Do you feel like, I feel like certainly President Trump's advisors would have been watching this. I don't know if President Trump would have been watching it. He'll certainly see some of the clips. That Trump endorsement is still looming out there. Governor Kemp, of course, has already endorsed for Dooley, but the Trump endorsement is still out there. Do you think that they would have seen anything in this debate to either give them pause about one of the two candidates or to get the president's endorsement on either side?
I do think Dooley's kind of, I wouldn't say like wish-washy, but vague answers to some of the issues that we pointed out before might have been a slight red flag, right? Because he isn't doubling down, tripling down on exactly what he believes in. I mean, you can kind of say that you support Donald Trump and echo his policies all you want, but you still have to follow that up with the specifics behind those things. I will be interested to see if Trump even endorses in this race. It's come so long without him weighing in. I would love to know what they're thinking in the White House about this.
I completely agree. It could come very late in the game. We keep hearing that he may be on the verge of an endorsement. But then that endorsement that was supposed to come before the end of the day, multiple days, has not come forward. Obviously, the president has a lot of other things on his mind. But even in the Texas race, he got in just the day before the election. And so it could come very, very late. It does feel like right now, Collins has that kind of MAGA flavor that the base responded to over and over in a lot of the other statewide races in Georgia. He's just in that lane. He kind of called it first. That's his tone. That's his tenor. That's his policy. And it does feel like he's got that MAGA warrior moment, going for him. I do think the electability issue is what Dooley is pushing. And I don't know if Republican voters are thinking that far ahead. I really don't. I feel, I don't know. We're going to find out. But what do we think about the electability argument? I think the idea that Ossoff would have an easier time with one or the other, that might be right. It might be, he might be a better general election candidate. Dooley might, but I don't know that that's anything that's really getting a groundswell of support right now.
I think that's something that political strategists think about, right? But I don't know if it's the everyday voter that's thinking, hey, this person might be my favorite, but I don't know if they have the best chance of winning statewide against a Democrat who might appeal to moderate, independent, even swing voters, right? And we know from our recent polling that we just did that Republicans have extremely high favor of Trump's policies, how Trump has been doing in office this term. So that will play heavily into that huge block of undecided voters in this race. But I don't think, again, an average voter is thinking, ooh, I don't know if Mike Collins or Derek Dooley is going to fare better against an Ossoff in a general election. I know that Ossoff's team is probably thinking that, though. Everyone's kind of on the political campaign side 4 steps ahead always.
Well, we're going to talk in the next segment about what Ossoff had to say about both Derek Dooley and Mike Collins. The Democratic ticket is set. Jon Ossoff and former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Bottoms appeared together for the first time. We'll take you there after the break. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. If you have a question you'd like to ask us here on the show, you can call the Politically Georgia call-in hotline anytime. Leave us a message and we'll play it back and answer your question right here on the show during our next Monday mailbag segment. That number is 770-810-5297. That's 770-810-5297. Well, from heated debates to a unified ticket, Keisha Bottoms and Senator Jon Ossoff appeared together for the first time Sunday. It was a high energy event, about 1,000 people at the Tabernacle. Riley, we were both there. I told you that up in the rafters where I was sitting for a while, it was giving kind of like Johnny's Hideaway energy. It was a lot of older voters upstairs. As a little bit like a disco dance party. You could just feel that the weight of that contested primary for governor was just off the shoulders of these supporters, and they were kind of just ready to roll into this next phase.
Yeah, I think Democrats got exactly what they wanted from that event. They wanted to build off of the high turnout that we saw from Democrats in the primary, keep that energy going. It was high energy the whole time in the Tabernacle in downtown Atlanta, beautiful concert hall. And attendees came early. There were quite a few attendees who came and lined up to get the front row very early. Loud cheers when both Ossoff and Mayor Keisha Bottoms took the stage. And I think it was kind of a good debut of their tag team campaign ahead of the general election.
Yeah, and this is the kind of the first piece of Ossoff's plan to have these two campaigning as partners. We've talked about this before. There are significant upsides for both of them by doing that. There are also potential downsides, especially for Senator Ossoff. We've heard from Atlantans really concerned about her tenure as mayor. And it's also a different strategy than Senator Warnock had with Stacey Abrams. They ran two really separate campaigns in 2022, and Ossoff did not waste a second in this case. He called Mayor Bottoms the minute she won on election night. He put out a statement about her. We talked to her campaign. Greg talked to him about this kind of partnership going forward. What do you make of that? Why are we seeing a different approach from Ossoff than we did from Senator Warnock and Stacey Abrams?
I think for them going into this midterm election, having a unified ticket and having it earlier than Republicans, who we know are just still battling it out ahead of the runoffs, can only kind of help in this situation when they're really trying to energize their base. And I'm glad you brought up the Stacey Abrams and Senator Warnock, because I remember when they first stepped out together, it was like a Clayton County event, and everyone was really surprised that they hadn't done that yet. To see Ossoff and Mayor Bottoms holding hands, right? Calling each other out in their speeches. It's very intentional. I think Mayor Bottoms has a lot to gain from the resources of the Ossoff campaign. I think Ossoff has a lot to gain from her support of Black voters, Black women voters. But as you mentioned, there are also definitely drawbacks to her record, and even some things that Ossoff might have to answer for his time in Congress.
I think that's right. Well, I spoke with a number of voters and supporters ahead of time. This was an Ossoff rally, and Mayor Bottoms was added to it once she won. And there were even Ossoff staffers handing out signs for Keisha Lance Bottoms, sort of to make that picture on the stage. They're also handing out signs that said Democratic unity, unified Democrats. So it's definitely the message they wanted to send. And when I talked to some of the supporters there, I'm like, what brings you out today? They're like, I'm here for Jon Ossoff. I love him. I love his tone. He's doing everything right. A couple of people, when I said, and how about Mayor Bottoms? The same response was, they were sort of still evaluating her. They had some concerns afterward. Mm-hmm. Those concerns, I think, were allayed. It's also the first time I've ever seen Keisha Lance Bottoms in a rally. I've not seen her. She's not done really rallies up to this point. That was not a part of her campaign for the nomination. But listen to this response from the crowd when her daughter Lincoln introduces her to this crowd.
Please give a warm welcome to my mom and our next governor, Keisha Lance Bottoms.
So Riley, we were both there, and the chants of Keisha, Keisha. I don't know that I was fully expecting that, but the entire crowd was fully on board with Mayor Bottoms. If they had concerns ahead of time, that was not evident at all once the rally got going.
I think the message across the Democratic Party for Democratic lawmakers, for Democratic voters who are very active, is we are unifying behind this candidate. We are past the primary. She won the primary outright with 56% of the votes or so. And despite her potential drawbacks from her record as mayor, she's our candidate, and we want to secure the governor's office. And I do think that they were really successful in launching that message with that rally. And you're right, I haven't seen her in that rally setting. I think she did really well. So it will be interesting to see if her mayoral record comes up in any of her speeches going forward, Patricia, because you pointed out that she didn't really touch on it at all.
She really didn't. I'm not surprised by that, because she's not talked a whole lot about being mayor up to this point. A big focus of her speech was Donald Trump. Here is what she had to say about both the president and also about either of her two potential challengers who she may be facing, Rick Jackson or Burt Jones. Here's what she said.
So while we may have to sit through another 2.5 weeks of their attacks on one another and even me, we already know we're running against Trump's Du Bois.
So, Riley, calling Rick Jackson and Burt Jones Trump's Du Bois was not something I ever thought I would hear anybody say. They certainly have called them other things, but that was unique. And she does not pull any punches. She was super relaxed, super aggressive, but it's a tone that group of people was really responding to. But I mean, she went very, very hard after both of her opponents and after Trump. Just very, very confident performance out there.
And I think that that's kind of her comfort zone, right? Because she has a lot of criticism from, Atlanta voters, people within her own party about how she handled things like the COVID-19 pandemic, the nationwide protests, calling for police reform, right? And so, but she has a lot of support and recognition on how she went after Trump during those times. And she stood up to Kemp related to the COVID-19 restrictions. That is where she kind of gets her national name recognition. And I'm not surprised to see her really go into Trump. I mean, remember when she resigned ahead of Trump being able to fire her when he took office? She was ready for that. She was ready to pull those punches. And I think it's a comfort zone for her, for sure.
I think that's exactly right. I think it's also the issue that unifies Democrats the most. They may have a lot of disagreements among themselves about the right way to go about a number of policy issues, but the fact that Donald Trump is their enemy is what really unifies not just Democrats, but I think some of the moderate Republicans that John Ossoff in particular is going to be going after. Well, once Ossoff came on stage, we heard a lot of the same from him, very, very similar themes. He hammered President Trump as usual. He called him a failed president and a national disgrace. He also, like she did, wrapped his two potential opponents, Mike Collins and Derek Dooley, into the anti-corruption theme that he's been using since 2020. And here's what that sounded like.
See, they tried to run Kemp, but he refused. So we're left with the congressman who's only a congressman because his daddy was a congressman, and the coach who's only a coach because his daddy was a coach. But Atlanta, it doesn't matter which one wins. They're both corrupt political insiders, and they're both pro-war, pro-tariff, and pro-cutting your health care. They're both Trump puppets, and we'll beat either one of them in November.
So I think Ossoff focusing on President Trump probably makes even more sense than it does for Keisha Bottoms, because he's selling himself to voters as the check and balance against the president. And that is specifically what he said during that rally.
And I think it also makes sense in terms of tying his Republican opponents so closely to Trump, because there is, a faction of the Republican Party who isn't a fan of the administration and doesn't really know what to do and who to support, because all these candidates are vying for the Trump endorsement. I mean, they're all the Trump candidate based on, how they are presenting themselves to voters. So it makes sense that like you said, Patricia, they're kind of rallying behind like the ultimate bad guy, quote unquote, right? Like the Democrats are tying their Republicans directly to DC and directly to all kind of the chaos and, debate that's going on in Congress and in the White House.
Yeah. So he called them both, of course, corrupt political insiders. In their debate, Dooley and Collins both signaled their support for President Trump on Iran, on his ballroom, on the fund to pay out January 6th participants. Here's what Ossoff said about that fund in particular.
He sued the U.S. government he commands for $10 billion. Then he settled the suit with himself to create a $1.8 billion slush fund so he can cut checks to cronies and Jan 6 foot soldiers who beat police officers with flagpoles, built a gallows on the Capitol lawn, and hunted the vice president to lynch him. Donald Trump's brown shirts. He pardoned them, and now he wants you to pay him.
So, Riley, he's already painting that contrast between him and whichever Republican is going to run against him, and he's not waiting to find out who it's going to be.
Yeah, and I will also point out, it's interesting, I was thinking about this morning, is that when they make Trump kind of the the thing or the person that they're going against in these races, as opposed to maybe their Republican opponents, is they'll always have some news of the day that they can pull from, right? There's always something that Trump is doing in Washington, D.C. that they can point to and, laud for voters. And it's kind of different from when you have, records that you're going off of, or no records at all that you're going off of, right? There's always going to be this feed of almost criticism that you can jump on. And, the voters who are seeing this stuff out of the day-to-day, that is just, what is happening? You'll never run out of material, right? If you're always going after Trump.
You really won't. Also, that anti-corruption theme is something that Ossoff used against David Perdue in 2020. And he's very clearly revving it back up, not just for President Trump, but for Collins and Dooley both. And even though Republicans, particularly Governor Kemp, makes a big distinction between Dooley and Collins and saying, well, Dooley doesn't have a record to run against. Collins has a voting record. He has a Twitter feed that he's going to have to defend. Kemp is saying, but Dooley's the most electable. Ossoff is saying, no, they're the same person. It doesn't matter who Republicans pick. Here's my playbook, and both of them will fall to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same kind of similar thing that we're seeing from Mayor Bottoms too. And I think that especially now when we have redistricting on the horizon, that Senate seat is really important. They're going to have to pull out kind of all of the stops and really get voters to rally behind. And I think the recent, you wrote a column recently about this, Patricia, but the recent voting rights ruling also gave them a little bit of fire to continue to kind of go after and, maybe rally and energize some more voters.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because both times that Senator Ossoff and Mayor Bottoms mentioned or talked about specifically the Voting Rights Act and the Supreme Court ruling that significantly weakened the Voting Rights Act, there's like this organic roar from the crowd that they were very much looking at this election as a time to push back on all of that. And Mayor Bottoms talked about not just the Supreme Court ruling, but also efforts to drown out Black voices. John Ossoff talked about Republicans picking this fight in Georgia in the cradle of the Civil Rights Act. And something that Pastor Jamal Bryant said before, as he was introducing Ossoff, I know it caught your attention. It certainly caught my attention. Of course, Pastor Bryant is a Black pastor, very well known, extremely politically active. And he said, when John Lewis died, God gave us John Ossoff to take up the fight. And that is how Ossoff, I think, he's not saying I'm John Lewis, but he is saying this is in the spirit of John Lewis. And he even said John Lewis will look down from heaven and be proud of what we've done here today.
I know. What a statement, and what a way to introduce a candidate. Voting rights is always going to be such a core platform and topic for the Democratic Party. And it makes me think about, 2020 election, 2021 runoffs, when we had Senator Warnock and we had John Ossoff, and there were so many voting changes going on, right? We had recounts, we had voting election quote reform by Republicans in the legislature, and how Democrats were able to capitalize on a lot of that issue and really rally their base to get those two statewide wins. And I think that the recent rollbacks and the pending redistricting is another opportunity to try to use that playbook and make it work again, years later.
Well, looking back on the weekend and this message of unity that the Democrats were sending, particularly John Ossoff embracing Keisha Bottoms, I cannot tell you how happy Republicans are that he've chosen to do this. I think they believe that Mayor Bottoms was their first choice of a Democrat to run against for governor. They feel like she has a record that they can really use to their advantage. And they feel like Ossoff did not have a long personal relationship with Bottoms going into this. He's sort of doing the work for them. He's saying, we are unified, and Republicans are like, yes, that's exactly right. And you're both going to pay for it in November. I think that Republicans love what they're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw Republicans already launching attacks against Mayor Bottoms even before her primary win. And that's the risk. That's the risk that the Ossoff campaign has to kind of weigh in this, is whether or not her anti-Trump message, her statewide and national recognition is going to outweigh some of the images that we're going to see. Like, we're going to see the cop car on fire. We've seen the cop car on fire. We're going to see more protests, pandemic pictures coming out of Atlanta. And Atlanta is really kind of this boogeyman already, and it always has been for the Republican Party and state lawmakers. So they're going to capitalize it. They have been, and Bottoms and Ossoff are going to have a response to those attacks.
Okay, well, I feel like we have just scratched the surface of these two races, governor and Senate. Riley, you also had a chance to be a panelist for that one-man debate. We can't wait to hear from you more about how the Burt Jones non-debate went. I'm going to be up with Rick Jackson at the event that he's doing instead of the debate, so we can come back and give everybody a full report later this week on Politically Georgia.
Can't wait to be back, Patricia.
Sounds great. That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you enjoyed what you heard, please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform, and share Politically Georgia with a friend. It helps others find the show and join the conversation. We'll talk to you next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.